On the afternoon of June 29, 1934, a 37-year-old police officer named Captain Alan Falby pressed the throttle on his police motorcycle and sped down a street in El Paso, Texas. Captain Falby's motorcycle lights and sirens were on because he was chasing a speeding pickup truck down the road. But despite the fact that obviously Captain Falby was in pursuit of this person, they were not slowing down at all. So Captain Falby had been a police officer for 11 years, and he loved his job, he loved his motorcycle, and he hated when suspects got away. So he kept his hand on the throttle and kept chasing down the suspect, but suddenly the truck he was going after slammed on its brakes and swerved hard to the left. Falby tried to slow down, but it was too late. He slammed into the back of this truck, and then he and his bike went sliding across the asphalt for a few seconds, and the whole time, Falby is feeling his body getting totally scraped against the pavement, and the wind's getting knocked out of him. And then finally, when he came to a stop, he was splayed out in the middle of the road, and his motorcycle, his beloved motorcycle, was laying on top of him, pinning his legs under him. And this bike weighed like 500 pounds. And adding insult to injury here, as Falby is screaming out in pain because obviously horrible injuries have been sustained here, he looks down the road and he sees the truck he was chasing, who clearly knew he just wrecked behind them. They're not gonna stay and help. They just drove off protecting themselves. And so pretty quickly, Falby kind of assessed the situation he was in. He tried for a second to push this bike off of him, but not only could he not move it, but every time he moved it just a little bit, the weight would kind of come down even harder and a little bit more pointed on his legs, which were crushed, and he had this excruciating pain down there. And worse, he's looking underneath him and he's seeing this growing pool of blood. Clearly, he's sustained potentially life-threatening injuries here, and he's all alone. Like, there's nobody here to help him, and he's totally stuck. And so even though he began calling out for help, the reality was, if nobody came along soon, he was done for. And he found himself starting to panic. Luckily though, just then, two men from down the road came running up to Captain Falby. Apparently they had been sort of behind the captain and were watching him pursuing this truck, and they had actually seen the accident. And so they had pulled over and they were now running up to see if he was okay. And so right away, without even needing to ask Captain Falby what he needed, these two men saw the situation. The bike is pinned on top of the cop. And so together, these two men were able to lift this heavy motorcycle off of the captain's legs. And as soon as they did, all three of them looked and they could clearly see, the reason there's all this blood all over the pavement. There was this huge gash in Captain Falby's leg right above his knee that was just pouring out blood. And Captain Falby, he saw that and he was already starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but just seeing this huge wound was totally disorienting. Fortunately though, the two men who had arrived on the scene to help Captain Falby kept their composure. And one of them actually noticed that Captain Falby was wearing a necktie. He had a formal police uniform on that had, a necktie as part of it. And he gently reached over and he told Captain Falby to relax, and he undid his necktie. Meanwhile, the other man, he ran over to the side of the road where this big tree was, and he got a stick, a pretty sturdy stick. And so the guy who undid the necktie, he tied it around Captain Falby's leg above the wound, basically cutting off circulation to that wound, a tourniquet. He tied it off, and then the other guy came back over with the stick, and he handed it to the guy with the necktie, and he took the stick and threaded it carefully through the necktie that was now wrapped around the captain's leg, and he began twisting the stick, wrapping up the fabric as he twisted it, which in turn mechanically tightened that tourniquet around the captain's leg, much tighter than you could do, without something mechanical. Like, this is somebody who clearly knew how to make a real tourniquet out of sort of everyday materials. And so they tie off the super tight tourniquet, they stop the bleeding, and it ultimately saves Captain Falby's life. In fact, by the time Captain Falby actually got brought to the hospital and they took off this DIY tourniquet and patched him up for real, the doctor would tell Captain Falby that, he was about 10 minutes away from death from blood loss. So had it not been for those two guys who showed up and made that tourniquet, he very likely would have died. 4 years later, on December 12th, 1938, Captain Falby was back at work. And he had been, ever since maybe 6 months after his injury. He had just gone back to work, fully recovered. He did have some scar tissue on his leg, but he was basically back to full capacity. And so on this particular day, Captain Falby was on patrol like he normally was in El Paso when he got a call over the radio about a bad car accident that had happened out on Route 80, which is a major road in that town. And so Captain Falby races over to the scene and he sees there's this car that's clearly veered off the road and smashed into a tree, and the driver, or who appears to be the driver, is sitting still in the driver's seat and they were unconscious. And so Falby was the first on the scene. He pulls over, he gets off his bike, he rushes over to the car, and he carefully pulls this unconscious man out of the car and he lays him on the ground. And he sees this guy has a horrible gash in his leg and it's bleeding profusely. But because this basically mirrored the exact same type of injury that Falby himself had had 4 years earlier when he crashed his motorcycle. Falby knew what to do. He didn't have, a issued tourniquet on hand, but he knew how to make one. He had a necktie, and there were sticks on the side of the road. So as quick as he could, he rushed over, grabbed a sturdy stick, took off his necktie, tied it around this man's leg, used the stick to tighten it up even further, and he cut off the bleeding to that wound. And so at this point, now that Captain Falby has realized that, okay, this guy appears to be stable now, he's not actively bleeding, he's clearly still breathing, albeit unconscious, but, it seems like he has a fighting chance here. And so he's waiting for paramedics to show up and take this guy to the hospital, and he's just sitting there, sort of, happy he was able to be here and save this guy, when he sort of looks at this guy and he realizes something. The man he had just saved with his DIY tourniquet was literally the actual same guy who had saved Captain Falby with a DIY tourniquet 4 years earlier. Captain Falby had never even gotten the guy's name. They had not stayed in touch after his accident. They had gone separate ways. But now he's looking down at this man and he's realizing it's the same one. The guy's name was Alfred Smith, and he would make a full recovery. But when he was rushed to the hospital, they would say, you were within about maybe 10 minutes of bleeding to death had it not been for Captain Falby. So literally, this DIY tourniquet story played out almost exactly the same way with these two guys doing it to each other, but 4 years apart. Later on, Captain Falby and Alfred Smith would give an interview to Ripley's Believe It or Not to talk about the incredible coincidence that saved both their lives. And when the interviewer at some point congratulated Captain Falby on his heroic efforts, Falby simply stated, quote, "One good tourniquet deserves another."
You see, Alfred Smith was the man who put the tourniquet around my leg and saved my life when my motorcycle hit that truck. After all, one good tourniquet deserves another.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I left the military in 2017, I left carrying a lot of baggage that I didn't really know I had. But what I was doing is basically bottling it all up and then snapping at people left and right. And the worst part was that even though I didn't really see this happening or why it was happening, I knew my behavior was destroying relationships left and right. And it left me feeling very stuck and isolated. The people close to me eventually came to my aid and encouraged me to seek professional help, go see a therapist. And admittedly, I was pretty resistant at first. I felt like I, could handle my business on my own. But I did eventually relent, and I did see a therapist. And pretty quickly I saw, therapy can give me something that I really couldn't give myself. And that was a truly non-judgmental space to be heard and really talk openly about what was going on in my life. And my therapist gave me lots of perspective that I couldn't give myself, and they taught me methods to cope with my anger and my sadness, and it really kind of turned my life around. Healing is not linear, and you don't have to do it alone. So if you're struggling right now and you don't know who to turn to, consider giving therapy a try. And a great therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp can connect you with a licensed therapist who will listen and help. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the evening of December 16th, 1984, a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Hao Ran walked through the courtyard of a pretty low-rent, seedy apartment complex in Hong Kong. He held hands with his longtime girlfriend, 23-year-old Jen Yu. The pair had just finished having dinner together at Hao Ran's apartment, which was part of this complex, but now he was walking his girlfriend across this courtyard to the other side of this complex, where her apartment was located. And so Hao Ran always walked Yu home. The pair had been together for a few years now. They'd actually met in college after a close mutual friend had introduced them, and ever since then, they had been inseparable. And so Hao Ran was just sort of protective of Yu, and he felt like their neighborhood was not very safe, and so anytime, especially at night, when he knew his girlfriend would be sort of out and about in their neighborhood, he would walk with her to keep her safe. And so that's what he was doing tonight. Eventually, the couple reached the front door of the section of this complex that would lead up to Yu's apartment. And so the two walked in through the front door, and they made their way over to the building's elevator bank. There were 2 elevators. Hao Ran reached over and pressed the up button, and then he and Yu just stood there and waited. And as they waited, they began to hear the familiar sound of one of the old elevator cars clanging its way down the elevator shaft. These were old and creaky and really kind of sketchy elevator cars that both Hao Ran and Yu hated riding on. But Yu lived up on the 13th floor, and neither of them liked walking up that many steps, and so it was sort of like, the only other choice is to ride one of these elevator cars. And so eventually the car came down, the doors dinged, they opened up, and nobody was on the car, and so Hao Ran and Yu stepped inside. They pressed 13, the doors rattled to a close, and they slowly began going up. And the whole time they're going up, neither of them spoke. It was just kind of like anxious anticipation that, hopefully this car will make it all the way up to the 13th floor. And so as they're moving up, they're hearing the car banging into the walls, and it's just so uncomfortable. But eventually they do reach the 13th floor, it dings, the doors open up, and both of them are so relieved when they step out of the car onto solid ground. And they make their way over to Yu's apartment, and the two, they give each other a hug and kiss and say they had a really nice time together. And then Yu, she retreats into her apartment, and Hao-ran goes back down the hallway and presses the down button to go back down the elevator. And sure enough, a couple of seconds later, Hao-ran heard the familiar sound of the elevator car shaking and banging against the shaft as it made its way up to him. There was a bell sound, the doors opened up, nobody was on the elevator car. Hao-ran stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, turned around, and watched as the doors closed. And then slowly he began to go down. And again, as he's going down, Hao-ran had that same sort of nervous energy, hoping this elevator didn't come to a, lurching stop or something, that it just got him down to the ground safely. And so he's going down, it's floor 12, 11, 10, down he's going. And then at floor 7, the car came to a stop. But it was kind of a hard stop, not like emergency status hard, but it was a fairly hard stop at floor 7. And so Hao-ran, he's instinctively thinking, okay, well, clearly someone on the 7th floor has called the elevator, and the doors are gonna open any second here, and someone's gonna get on. But as he's waiting for the doors to open to alleviate this sudden stress that, oh my God, is something wrong here? The doors don't open. And instead, the elevator suddenly lurches down another foot. It stops. But clearly, this is not normal elevator behavior. There is something wrong with this elevator. Like his worst fears are coming true, and the doors still are not opening. And so Hao-ran's looking around wondering, what's he gonna do? What can he do? He's trying to tell himself that everything's okay. Maybe the doors still will open up, but they're not. And then he begins to smell something. It was almost like a sort of chemical smell. He couldn't really place what it was, and he's sort of looking around, wondering what's going on here, and his panic is rising, like this is a bad situation, has no idea what's happening, but clearly something bad is going on here. And then this already horrible situation gets 1,000 times worse, because he looks down and he sees the floor of the inside of the elevator is now on fire. And as he's realizing the floor is on fire, and that's what he was smelling as like this burning smell, he sees his own legs are now on fire. And so in a completely panicked, like fight or flight moment, Hao-ran remembered that most elevator cars have an escape hatch somewhere, usually on the ceiling, and he looked up and he couldn't believe it. There it was. There was this escape hatch to get out of the car. And so right away, that's what Hao-ran began trying to do. He kind of scaled the walls of this car, he punched open this hatch, and he climbed out of the elevator, out of the fire, saving his own life. And so while all this chaos was happening in the elevator shaft, Hao-ran's girlfriend, Yu, was in her apartment looking out the window. And her view was basically the same courtyard that she and Hao-ran had walked across just, 5 minutes ago to get to her apartment building. And it was sort of customary that every time he would drop her off at her apartment, she would look out the window and wait for him to come out the front door, and she would watch him walk back across that same courtyard to his building on the other side. And so you sort of understood how long it would take, for Hao-ran to come down the elevator and walk out the door. But now it had been, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, and he still hadn't come out the front door, and there really wasn't any reason for him not to have exited the building at this point. And she started to get worried. And so given the fact that Yu, much like Hao-ran, was fearful that those old elevators in this building were eventually gonna get stuck while they were on them, given she had that fear, she instinctively was like, oh my gosh, maybe he's stuck in the elevator. Like that's why he hasn't left the building yet. And so instinctively, she left her apartment and walked down the hallway to the elevator bank, and she looked up above the doors, and it showed where the respective cars were located. And she saw that one of the cars was stuck at floor 7, and it wasn't moving up or down. It didn't matter if she pressed the button, that car would not go up or down. The other car would, but not that car. And so it convinced her that Hao-ran has got to be trapped on that elevator car. He's stuck right there. I better call authorities. And so she did. She called the fire department and said, hey, my boyfriend, I believe he's trapped in the elevator. And so just a few minutes later, the local fire department showed up to the apartment complex, and they walked up to the 7th floor where they believed, this car was stuck. Now, they were not in some crazy, emergency mode running down the hall to open up this elevator car. because they're thinking, it's really just an inconvenience getting stuck on an elevator car. It's not like life and death. And so they just make their way up to the 7th floor by taking the stairs. And then on the 7th floor, they go over to the elevator bank where the 2 doors are to the respective elevator cars. And on the one that, shows the car is stuck on floor 7, it says the number right above the door. They use their tools to pry open the doors to see, the car right behind it. And once they pry it open, they do see the trapped elevator car, and it's not exactly where it's supposed to be. It's not sitting, right in front of the door. It's actually situated sort of below the 7th floor. They can basically only see the top of the elevator car. Like, this car has actually gotten stuck between the 7th floor and the 6th floor. But that in and of itself was not a huge thing. I mean, they could basically mechanically move this car up and down if they needed to, either up to the 7th or down to the 6th to get whoever was on the car out. What they noticed right away, though, which was the way bigger problem, is they smelled and saw smoke, and it was coming from this elevator car, the trapped car. And so the firefighters immediately go into, okay, we gotta figure out where this fire is coming from. Is it coming from this elevator car? Is it somewhere down below at the bottom of the elevator shaft? Like, they don't know. But from their perspective, outside looking into the shaft, they could see that the hatch, the emergency hatch on this stopped elevator car was open because they can see the roof of this car. And they're thinking, okay, maybe the trapped guy is right in there and we can look down, grab him, pull him out, and deal with this fire. And so they go in, they're yelling out Howron's name, and they look down into this elevator car. They're literally on top looking through this hatch, and they see the carpet inside of this car is all charred and burned, and there's some smoke sort of sitting inside the car. But there's nobody inside the car. It's empty, but they see there's blood all over the inside and up on the walls. And then they realize there's also blood kind of coming up, through this hatch, and it's on the top of the elevator car. Clearly, whoever was in this car was badly hurt as they exited out the roof. But now the firefighters are wondering, well, where did he go? Did he fall down to the bottom? I mean, because basically there's just these 2 elevator cars that move up and down inside of this singular shaft. There's basically nothing dividing the 2 shafts that these elevator cars move in. It's kind of like one big shaft. And so to the side of this frozen car is this huge shaft, multi-story shaft that goes all the way to the ground. As they look over the edge and they shine their light down the elevator shaft because, the car on this side was up top. It was not obstructing their view. And sure enough, there is a man, maybe 1 floor down, who looks very badly injured. He's got cuts all over him. He's bleeding. It looked like his ankle was broken. And he was sort of huddled on this very small platform, basically 1 floor below. At every floor, when you walk onto the elevator, when those doors open up, there's a 1 foot long little platform that extends into the shaft just enough that it meets the entrance to the car. So when the car opens up, you walk across this little platform into the elevator, the door's shut and it goes up or down. But if you're in the elevator shaft, each floor basically has that little protrusion, that 1 foot, small platform. And there's the guy, presumably Howron, who is positioned, perched on the one right below them, on that little platform. And so, of course, the firefighters forget the fire, because, that's a separate issue at this point, and they gotta go rescue Howron. And so they go down to the 6th floor, they open up the doors, they grab Howron, they pull him into the hallway where he is safe. He's obviously in an enormous amount of pain, he's been burned, he's got a broken ankle, he's in rough shape, but it appears like he's going to survive. And so as the firefighters placed Howron on a stretcher, and he's barely talking, he's very shaken up, he's just laying there. And so at this point, the girlfriend, she found out the firefighters had saved her boyfriend and he was on the 6th floor, and so she comes charging down the stairs, runs down the 6th floor hallway to be by her boyfriend's side, and she looks at Howron for the first time, and she just freezes, and she stares at him, and she says, "That's not my boyfriend." It would turn out this whole elevator disaster was highly coordinated, because what neither Howron nor his girlfriend knew was that the same mutual friend who had actually introduced the 2 of them deeply regretted it. He himself was in love with Yu, and he couldn't bear to see her with another man. And so this mutual friend, whose name was Liu Wenjong, that night, he had secretly waited until he was sure Howron had climbed on the elevator car by himself, and then he had cut off electricity to that car, freezing it at the 7th floor, actually between the 7th and the 6th floor. And then he climbed on top of the elevator car, opened up the hatch just enough to pour kerosene into the car with Howron. That was the smell that Howron began to talk about and smell inside the shaft. Like, he clearly knew there was something off, but Howron didn't realize it was, this friend of his right above him. And then before Howron could even understand what was happening, Liu lit a match and threw it into the elevator car. That was what caused the big fire. But then when Howron panicked and climbed up out of the hatch to save himself, Liu was waiting for him and he stabbed Howron and then threw him off the roof of this elevator car where he fell all the way down 7 floors to the bottom of the shaft, where he died. The man that was crouched on that platform, 1 floor below where this car was Liu. And basically what he did is after murdering Howron, he leapt onto that platform from the top of this elevator car down onto that platform, sort of intentionally to hurt himself, to make it seem somehow like, he was just trying to help Howron, but then, basically fell and hurt himself too. Like he didn't do anything wrong, but when they looked at Howron inside the shaft, he was clearly stabbed. And also they knew this fire had been started on purpose. It was clearly arson. And so once all this evidence had piled up and it was pretty obvious that Liu had done it, he did confess, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. One evening in February of 1966, a 34-year-old man named Jose Luis Peña walked down a staircase inside of a cafe in Madrid, Spain. At the bottom of the stairs was this sort of basement seating area. It was pretty quiet, only a few people were down there. But Jose Luis, as soon as he was down there, he saw his friend, Fernando Sesma, had already found a booth on the other end of the seating area, and he was beckoning Jose Luis over. And so Jose Luis, who had come here to meet Fernando, eagerly walked over towards him. And then before he even sat down, Fernando, who was grinning ear to ear, he held up this envelope and showed Jose Luis, like, I gotta tell you about this. So Jose Luis and Fernando were both members of a small club called Baleña Alegre, which means happy whale in Spanish, and their meetings were all about aliens and UFOs. Now, Fernando was actually a post office employee during the day, but at night, he was the de facto leader of this club, and he'd always been fascinated by aliens. As for Jose Luis, he actually was much more of a skeptic. He actually kind of actively did not believe in aliens, UFOs, or anything paranormal. But about a month prior, he'd had this sort of inexplicable, UFO sighting, or he didn't even know what it was. He was driving along and thought he saw something in the sky that didn't necessarily make him a believer. But he didn't know who to talk to about this thing he had seen. He couldn't make sense of it. And so that's how he had found his way into this group. It was just because it was an outlet to talk about this weird thing he had been through. And to be honest, he didn't know if he'd be staying any longer than maybe the next couple of weeks. He was just here for now. But regardless, Jose Luis and Fernando had made plans to meet up in this cafe tonight to sort of catch up on all things about the club, before their actual club meeting that was going to happen maybe 30 minutes from when they were actually meeting. But as Jose Luis is sitting down, Fernando's got this envelope that he's really excited about. And once Jose Luis sits down, Fernando puts it in front of him and he's like, look, there's no return address. And he points, there's like this strange symbol on the outside of this envelope, and it just looks sort of foreign, like Jose Luis didn't really even know what he was looking at. But Fernando, who again is a full believer, he says to Jose Luis, he's like, I just got this letter and I'm gonna show it to the club tonight because I think it's from an alien. Now, when Jose Luis heard this, he was open to the idea of UFOs being a thing because, again, he couldn't explain what happened to him, but he just felt like, give me a break. Like, what, an alien sent you a letter? Why? Why would they send you a letter? And he sort of said as much to Fernando, but Fernando, he was ready for this. Like, he knew Jose Luis was a skeptic, and he knew he would cut this letter apart. But Fernando, he took the envelope back, before Jose Luis could say anything more about how fake this was, and he pulled out the letter inside. And the letter, it was typed out, so it wasn't by hand, it was by typewriter. And the writer wrote that they were literally from an alien race called the Umites, and they'd come from a planet called Umo. And they said that, the Umites had very advanced technology, and they'd actually already been living on Earth for the last 16 years. However, humans didn't recognize them because they sort of looked like normal people. And so this alien writer said, for all these years, they had been searching for, a true believer to share this secret with. And apparently, the believer they had found was Fernando. Now, Jose Luis could tell that Fernando was really excited, and so he sort of throttled back how much he sort of rained on his parade here, and he just let him have his moment and said, wow, that's really interesting. And then before long, the other members of their club came into this basement seating area inside this cafe. And as soon as they were all assembled, Fernando got up to the front of the room and he held up this envelope and he said, "You won't believe it. I got this letter. It's from an alien race. They want to talk to me. Like, can you believe this? We finally have proof. The aliens are here." And unbelievably, as he says this, Jose Luis is looking out to get the reaction of the other folks in the club to see how invested they are, in this new revelation. And Jose Luis can't believe it when others in this club begin reaching into their bags and pulling out identical looking envelopes with these strange symbols on them. And they're like, "We got these letters too. We just got them last night. We brought them here for this meeting. Can you believe it?" And so the whole meeting was completely dominated by, talks of the Umaite alien race and how, these letters have got to be legitimate. Like, this can't be a prank the way Jose Luis said it could be a prank. Like, this has got to be real. Who would want to prank us? We're just this little group that, investigates the paranormal. Like, why would anyone care about pranking us? And Jose Luis said to them, "That's why, because you believe in the paranormal and they're playing into that. Like, you're the perfect target to be pranked. That's why this is likely happening." But pretty much the entire club disagreed with Jose Luis. And they reminded him, Fernando in particular, that he should recall the club's motto, which was to believe everything until proven otherwise. Basically, the whole group was demanding that Jose Luis keep an open mind, because this might be the exact moment most of them were all waiting for. A little over a year later, in June of 1967, and Jose Luis was back inside of that basement seating area of that cafe in Madrid, Spain. To this point, Jose Luis had continued attending these meetings of the Balena Alegre. He'd thought about leaving a couple of times, especially as this whole Umaite fervor had really took hold inside the club. He didn't buy it, but he had stuck it out and continued attending meetings. But on this particular day, he was here for a very specific reason. It was because he had seen an article in the local newspaper that he knew the club would be really eager to see. So at this point, Fernando actually was writing a weekly column in the newspaper about the Umaites, because shortly after getting that first letter and all the other members of the club getting those letters, he had written to the news, they had been really interested, and asked for weekly updates. And sure enough, over the past year, the club continued receiving these letters, Fernando included, from the Umaites, whoever they were, and he would write these update columns. And really, by this point, a year later, that column had become really popular in Madrid. And so people of Madrid were pretty invested in the Umaites and, whatever was happening with them. And also adding to the intrigue was these letters were no longer just arriving on the doorsteps of Balena Alegre members. They were arriving in front of random people's homes all over Madrid. Like, random people were being contacted by, this alien race. Now, Jose Luis still very much believed that there is no way this could be real. Like, this can't actually be aliens. But the Umaites had basically become the only conversation topic in the club every time they met. Like, it was all they ever talked about. And it increasingly felt like it was a lot of what Madrid talked about. I mean, this was a big deal at the time. But today, the reason Jose Luis had brought the newspaper to bring to the group was actually because, they had published something that even to Jose Luis was pretty unbelievable. It wasn't an article that Fernando had published. It was not, another recounting of another letter showing up. It was actually, this newspaper themselves covering what appeared to be a local UFO sighting. And apparently somebody had captured a photo of this, presumed UFO, and that photo had been published in the news. And wouldn't you know, on the outside of this alien craft was that same strange symbol that adorned the front of all the Umaite letters that Fernando and the club members and all people of Madrid were getting from these Umaites. It was the same symbol. And so it sort of felt like for the first time, it was not just, letters that could be fabricated and sent to the masses. It was like this vehicle that had shown up in Madrid that had that same symbol, like it had to be the Umaites. Also, remember, it's 1967, and so faking photographs was very hard to do, at least, making something look convincing. And so that's why Jose Luis, he had brought this newspaper in to show the other members of this club, to be like, what, I gotta say, this is pretty unbelievable. And, the reaction from the club was equally amazed. They had all already seen this photo. I mean, they are completely locked in on all things Umaites. And so this photo was sort of like the centerpiece of that day's discussion. And Jose Luis found himself sort of admitting that, this is pretty unbelievable and I don't know what to make of it. But by the end of the meeting, Jose Luis still cautioned the group, like, look, I know this looks so real and it feels so real. I mean, I'm bringing this to you. I think this is pretty unbelievable. But there's just gotta be an angle here. Somebody has to be faking this. Like, there isn't a way that some alien species is doing this. This just doesn't feel real to me. But At this point, it was like everybody shut him down. They're like, hey, you brought this to us today. You're the one saying this is hard to deny. Like, this makes it feel real. And so at this point, forget your dissenting opinion. What we need to do as a group is take the news of the Umites and this photograph and all the letters and not just show it to the rest of Spain, but we need to show it to the whole world. And so sure enough, after that, Fernando began going on TV and insisting the Umites were real, which actually did cause mass panic across all of Spain. People couldn't explain the thousands of letters and that UFO photo, and so belief in the Umites really caught on. And while Fernando and seemingly the entire general public of Spain became increasingly radicalized, Jose Luis grew more isolated from his friends in Belena Alegre. And soon he quit attending meetings altogether. And then shortly after that, he began going on TV, but not to advocate for the belief in the Umites, but the opposite. To say, stop believing in this. There's no way this is real. But nobody really listened to him. The Umite story had really taken on a life of its own, and it was sort of beginning to spin out of control. A few years after the Umite letters began showing up and making headlines, two men had lied down on railroad tracks and basically taken their own lives by letting the train run them over, and police actually found notes in these men's pockets that just said, "The aliens call us." And given the timing of, their deaths, it seemed like it had to be connected to the Umites. Then, two Spanish sisters died in a murder-suicide, and police discovered they had been receiving Umite letters that might have contributed to this crime. By the 1970s, there were also multiple Umite-related cults operating in Spain, and one of those cults targeted young boys. And in the early 1970s, when Jose Luis's own son was 7 years old, that child was targeted by one of these cults to be brought in because of his father. Like, they were trying to bring this child in to be exposed to who knows what, just because of Jose Luis's public stature as it related to the Umites. Now, Jose Luis's son would not be pulled into that cult. He would be just fine. But for Jose Luis, this was pretty eye-opening and terrifying. The idea that his family could be targeted because of this Umite stuff was crazy. And so around that same time, Jose Luis stopped trying to tell people to not believe in this stuff and instead retreated from the public eye and just tried to live a quiet, isolated life. Over the next several decades, people all over Spain continued receiving Umite letters, and nobody knew why. And these cults that, sort of focused on the Umites continued to flourish and continued to believe that absolutely the Umites are real. As for Jose Luis, he really did try to live a private life away from all this craziness, but it was hard to escape it. He would see Fernando on the news all the time talking about the Umites, and he even published a book about it. It was kind of everywhere. But everything changed in 1996. 30 years after the first Umite letter was received. One night in 1996, people all over Spain gathered in front of their TVs very expectantly as there was going to be this special report about the Umites. And when the guest of honor, who was going to be a big part of the special report, came on screen and began talking about the Umites, it truly shocked the entire country. This person explained that in their own lives, they had recently had a near-death experience. And that experience had made them realize it was finally time to admit to the world that they had made the whole Umite thing up. It really was a hoax. They said they had written those first Umite letters and sent them to Belena Alegre because they believed they would be susceptible to believing in the hoax. And they also said they really did fake that photograph that was put in the newspaper of the UFO with the strange symbol that matched the symbol on all those letters. But the person said, after that, they sort of had no intention to keep up the hoax. However, the story kind of took off, and all these copycats began sending their own Umite letters to random people all over Spain, and then the news picked it up, and it was everywhere. And even though this person was trying so hard to literally tell the world that they faked this thing, nobody listened. The hoaxer was none other than Jose Luis. He literally had done this just to show the Belena Alegre how easy it was to get people to believe in aliens and conspiracies, because that's what people want. He basically wanted to show them that he was skeptical and he had this UFO experience and he was trying to get to the bottom of it, but everyone's like, oh, it's gotta be aliens. And it's like, no, let's step back and be rational. He was trying to prove a point that, look, I faked aliens writing to you and you all believed it. Like, how are we gonna actually figure out what's real and what's not? But he wasn't expecting it to take on a life of its own. However, Jose Luis's confession never actually reached Fernando, because Fernando died years before Jose Luis admitted this really was a hoax. And so he died absolutely still believing that Umites were real. And despite the fact there were at least 4 deaths linked to this Umo craze, and also there were all these cults that were doing who knows what, probably illicit and illegal things, also tied to the Umo hoax, despite all that, Jose Luis never faced any criminal charges. He died in 2014.